The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the busy streets of downtown Arlington as Officer Daniel Carter guided his patrol car slowly through traffic. It was a typical shift, nothing extraordinary, nothing urgent. Carter had been with the department for nearly 8 years, and routine patrols like this had become second nature to him. He knew the neighborhoods, the busy corners, and the usual patterns of activity that unfolded every evening as the city transitioned from work hours to nightlife. People moved along the sidewalks, carrying shopping bags, talking on phones, and heading toward restaurants or parking garages. For Carter, it was just another day maintaining order and keeping an eye out for anything unusual. His radio crackled occasionally with updates from dispatch, but nothing demanded immediate attention. As he turned onto Jefferson Avenue, something caught his attention near the front steps of a large government office building. A man stood near the entrance, leaning casually against a railing while speaking on his phone. The man appeared calm, dressed neatly in dark jeans and a gray jacket, completely absorbed in his conversation. The man was Marcus Reed. From Carter's perspective, Marcus seemed out of place. The officer slowed the patrol car, his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched Marcus through the windshield. There was no clear sign of wrongdoing, no suspicious movement, no complaints from anyone nearby, but Carter's instincts began to nudge him. Sometimes officers rely on experience to notice subtle things others miss, and Carter believed that was happening now. He parked his patrol car along the curb and stepped out, adjusting the body camera attached to the front of his uniform. The quiet hum of traffic continued around him as he approached the building steps. Marcus ended his phone call just as Carter reached the sidewalk. "Excuse me," Carter said firmly. Marcus turned, slightly surprised but calm. "Yes, officer?" Carter studied him carefully for a moment before speaking again. "What are you doing here?" Marcus blinked, clearly confused by the question. "Just finishing a phone call. I'm waiting for someone inside the building." His answer was simple and direct, but something about the interaction didn't sit right with Carter. Perhaps it was the location, perhaps it was Marcus's calm tone, or perhaps Carter had already convinced himself something wasn't right. "You got some ID on you?" Carter asked. Marcus hesitated for a brief second, not out of fear, but out of confusion. "May I ask why?" he replied respectfully. The question instantly shifted the atmosphere. Carter's posture stiffened, and his tone sharpened just slightly. "I'm asking the questions here." Pedestrians continued passing by, some glancing briefly at the interaction before continuing on their way. To most people it looked like a normal police conversation, but the tension between the two men had already begun to grow. Marcus remained calm, hands relaxed at his sides, his voice steady. "I'm not refusing, officer," he said carefully. "I just want to understand what's going on." For Carter, that response felt less like cooperation and more like resistance. His eyes hardened slightly as he looked around the area again. In his mind, a simple situation had just become something more complicated. What neither man fully realized yet was that the moment Carter stepped out of his patrol car, a series of official recording systems, his body camera, nearby surveillance cameras, and even a traffic camera at the intersection, had begun documenting every second of their encounter. And before the evening was over, those recordings would turn this routine patrol into something far bigger than either of them expected. Officer Daniel Carter stood firmly on the sidewalk, his posture rigid as he looked Marcus Reed up and down. What had begun as a simple question now carried a sharper edge. Marcus could feel the shift in tone, but he kept his composure, understanding that any sudden movement or defensive reaction might make the situation worse. "I asked for your identification," Carter repeated, his voice slightly louder this time. Marcus nodded calmly. "I understand, officer. I'm just trying to understand why I'm being asked." The question seemed reasonable, but Carter's expression hardened. In his mind, Marcus's calm responses were beginning to feel like challenges to his authority. He had dealt with situations like this before, and often people tried to stall or question officers instead of complying immediately. "You're standing outside a government building acting suspicious," Carter replied. "So yes, I need to see your ID." Marcus glanced around briefly. People were walking past them, some slowing their pace slightly to observe the interaction before continuing down the street. From the outside, it might have looked like a routine police check, but Marcus could already sense the tension building. "I'm just waiting for someone who works inside," Marcus said evenly. I had a phone call to finish, that's all. Carter crossed his arms for a moment, studying Marcus's face as if looking for signs of dishonesty. But Marcus's calm demeanor didn't change. Who are you waiting for? Carter asked. A colleague, Marcus replied. We're meeting about some paperwork. The explanation was simple, but Carter wasn't satisfied. Something about the situation had already convinced him that Marcus was hiding something, even though there was no real evidence to support that belief. Listen, Carter said, stepping a little closer. When an officer asks for identification, you provide it. That's how this works. Marcus nodded again. His voice remained respectful, but he was clearly trying to maintain his rights without escalating the situation. I'm not refusing, officer, he said carefully. I just want to understand if I've done something wrong. For a brief moment, Carter said nothing. The silence hung between them as traffic moved through the intersection nearby. To Carter, Marcus's question sounded like resistance. To Marcus, it was simply a reasonable request for clarity. The misunderstanding widened the gap between them. Carter placed one hand near his duty belt, not in a threatening way, but in a gesture that signaled control. Right now, you're being detained for questioning, he said. Marcus's eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise. Detained? For what reason? For suspicious behavior, Carter replied quickly. Marcus took a slow breath, remaining calm. Standing outside a building while making a phone call is suspicious. The words were spoken quietly, but they clearly irritated Carter. You're making this harder than it needs to be, the officer said sharply. Marcus reached slowly into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. He opened it and handed over his identification without sudden movement. Carter took the card and examined it carefully, holding it up slightly as he compared the photo to Marcus's face. Marcus Reed. The name meant nothing to Carter, but somewhere else, quietly running in the background, the small camera attached to Carter's chest was recording everything: the tone of his voice, the questions he asked, and the growing tension in the interaction. Nearby surveillance cameras were capturing the scene from different angles, and though neither man realized it yet, the footage from this moment would later become the center of a serious review. What Carter believed was a simple stop was slowly becoming something much bigger. Officer Daniel Carter studied the identification card in his hand for several seconds before handing it back to Marcus Reed. The name and photo matched, and nothing about the ID appeared unusual. Still, Carter didn't step away. Instead, he remained standing directly in front of Marcus, his posture stiff and watchful. Marcus slipped the card back into his wallet and placed it calmly inside his jacket pocket. Despite the tension in the air, his expression stayed controlled. He had already sensed that this interaction wasn't going to end quickly. All right, Marcus said politely. Is there anything else you need from me? Carter didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the surrounding area again, the entrance to the government building, the sidewalk, the passing cars. Several pedestrians had begun slowing down as they walked past, their curiosity growing as the conversation between the officer and Marcus continued. Why were you standing here again? Carter asked, even though Marcus had already explained. I told you, Marcus replied patiently. I'm meeting someone inside the building. I finished a phone call while I was waiting. Carter narrowed his eyes slightly. Something about Marcus's calm confidence bothered him. In Carter's experience, most people became nervous or defensive during police questioning. Marcus, however, seemed steady and composed. To Carter, that composure felt suspicious. You work here? Carter asked. Marcus shook his head slightly. Not exactly. What does that mean? It means I don't work in this building full-time, Marcus said carefully. But I have business here. The answer was vague, but not dishonest. Still, Carter seemed unsatisfied. Business doing what? Marcus hesitated for a moment. He wasn't trying to hide anything, but he also didn't feel obligated to explain every detail of his personal schedule. It's just a meeting, Marcus said. Nothing complicated. Carter exhaled slowly, clearly growing irritated. Look, he said firmly, people don't usually just stand around outside government buildings unless there's a reason. Marcus glanced toward the large stone entrance behind him. The building housed several public offices, and people came and went throughout the day. That's exactly why I'm here, Marcus replied calmly. For a reason. A few steps away, two pedestrians slowed down slightly, watching the interaction from a distance. Their quiet curiosity added to the pressure in the moment. Carter noticed the attention and straightened his shoulders. "You seem pretty comfortable questioning everything I say," Carter remarked. "I'm not questioning you," Marcus replied gently. "I'm just trying to understand what's happening." But Carter was already growing frustrated. What had begun as a simple conversation now felt like a challenge to his authority. "You know," Carter said, lowering his voice slightly, "most people cooperate when an officer speaks to them." Marcus kept his tone even. "I am cooperating." The officer shook his head slightly, unconvinced. The tension between them thickened as the seconds passed. Traffic continued moving through the nearby intersection, and the distant sound of a siren echoed somewhere deeper in the city. Yet, on that sidewalk, the moment felt strangely still. Marcus stood calmly with his hands visible at his sides. Carter stood rigid, watching him carefully. Neither man moved. Neither man backed down. What Carter didn't realize was that his body camera continued capturing every word and every gesture. At the same time, a security camera mounted above the courthouse entrance recorded the entire interaction from another angle. For now, it was just an uncomfortable street encounter. But the tension building in that moment would soon push the situation further than either man expected. The tension between Officer Daniel Carter and Marcus Reed had begun drawing more attention from passers-by. A few people walking along Jefferson Avenue slowed their pace, glancing over at the two men standing near the courthouse steps. To them, it looked like a routine police stop. But anyone watching closely could sense that something about the interaction had shifted. Carter adjusted his stance and took a small step closer to Marcus. His patience was clearly wearing thin. "You're being very difficult," Carter said, his voice firm. Marcus remained calm, keeping his hands relaxed and visible. "Officer, I'm not trying to be difficult," he replied quietly. "I've answered your questions." "That's not the point," Carter said sharply. "You're standing outside a government building, acting suspicious and questioning my authority while I'm doing my job." Marcus blinked slowly, surprised by the accusation. "Standing here isn't illegal," he said. "I'm simply waiting for someone." The calm tone in Marcus's voice seemed to frustrate Carter even more. In the officer's mind, the situation had already gone too far to simply walk away. "Turn around," Carter suddenly ordered. Marcus frowned slightly. "Excuse me?" "I said turn around," Carter repeated. "You're being detained while I figure out what's going on here." For a brief moment, Marcus looked genuinely confused. "Detained? Officer, I've cooperated with everything you've asked." Carter's hand rested near his duty belt as he spoke again. "Then you shouldn't have a problem doing what I say." Marcus took a slow breath. He knew that resisting even verbally could make the situation worse. The last thing he wanted was to escalate the encounter. Still, he felt the need to clarify. "Am I under arrest?" Marcus asked calmly. "No," Carter replied. "But you are being detained. For what reason?" Carter paused, clearly irritated by the question. "I've already told you," he said. "Suspicious behavior." Marcus glanced around the area again. Cars moved through the intersection, pedestrians walked past, and the courthouse entrance stood only a few steps behind him. Nothing about the scene suggested any kind of crime, but Carter seemed determined to push the situation further. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Carter said. Marcus hesitated for just a second, not in defiance, but in disbelief. "You're handcuffing me?" he asked. "Temporary detention," Carter replied quickly. "Standard procedure." Several people nearby had stopped completely now, quietly observing the interaction. One man across the street pulled out his phone, possibly recording. Marcus noticed the growing attention, but kept his focus on the officer. "Officer Carter," Marcus said slowly, reading the name on the badge. "This seems unnecessary." Carter's eyes narrowed. "What's unnecessary?" he said. "Is you trying to tell me how to do my job?" Marcus realized the situation had reached a critical point. The officer had already made up his mind. Without arguing further, Marcus slowly turned around as instructed and placed his hands behind his back. Carter pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt and secured them around Marcus's wrists. The metal clicked loudly in the quiet moment. To Carter, it was just another routine detention. But above them, the courthouse security camera continued recording everything. And the small body camera on Carter's chest captured the entire moment from only a few feet away. Every word, every command, every second of escalation. At the time, Carter believed he was maintaining control of a situation. He had no idea that the footage from this moment would soon raise serious questions about his actions. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut echoed softly on the quiet sidewalk. Marcus Reed stood still, his hands secured behind his back, facing the courthouse steps. Despite the uncomfortable position, his posture remained steady and controlled. Officer Daniel Carter stepped back slightly, watching Marcus closely as if expecting resistance. But Marcus didn't struggle, argue, or raise his voice. Instead, he simply took a slow breath and remained calm. Pedestrians nearby had begun paying more attention now. A few people had stopped walking entirely, standing several yards away while quietly observing the situation. Some exchanged curious glances, unsure of what had led to the detention. Marcus turned his head slightly toward Carter. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and measured. "Officer," he said politely, "I'd still like to understand why this is happening." Carter crossed his arms briefly, clearly confident that he had the situation under control. "You're being detained until I finish my investigation," he replied. "It's simple." Marcus nodded slowly, though the explanation didn't really clarify anything. "With respect," Marcus continued, "I've told you why I'm here. I'm waiting for someone inside the building." Carter looked toward the courthouse entrance as if considering the possibility. For a brief second, it seemed like he might reconsider the situation, but his expression quickly hardened again. "People say a lot of things when they're questioned," Carter said. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the street where several people continued watching the encounter from a distance. The situation was uncomfortable, but Marcus refused to let frustration take over. He understood how easily a moment like this could spiral further if emotions got involved. "I'm not trying to argue with you," Marcus said quietly. "I'm simply asking for clarity." Carter shook his head slightly. "You keep asking questions," he said. "That's part of the problem." Marcus almost smiled at the irony of the statement, but chose not to react. For Carter, the calmness Marcus displayed felt unusual. Most people in handcuffs became nervous, angry, or defensive. Marcus did none of those things. He remained patient, composed, and respectful. That calm confidence unsettled the officer more than open resistance might have. "What exactly is your business here?" Carter asked again. Marcus looked toward the courthouse doors behind him. "I told you," he said. "I'm meeting someone who works inside." "Who?" Carter asked immediately. Marcus hesitated briefly. "I'd prefer to speak about that once this situation is resolved." The answer only deepened Carter's suspicion. "See, that's what I'm talking about," Carter said. "You're not being straightforward." Marcus remained silent for a moment before responding. "I've answered every question you've asked," he said calmly. "But I also have the right to ask why I'm being detained." The two men stood there in silence for several seconds. The late afternoon light reflected off the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Cars passed by slowly, and the faint murmur of city life continued around them. Yet in the middle of that normal routine, the tension between the officer and the civilian continued to grow. Carter believed he was maintaining control of the situation. Marcus simply waited. What neither man realized in that moment was that multiple cameras had captured every step of the encounter, from the first question to the moment the handcuffs were applied. Soon, those recordings would tell the entire story. And when they did, the calm man standing in handcuffs would not be the one under scrutiny. Officer Daniel Carter stood beside Marcus Reed, keeping a watchful eye on the quiet street while holding his small notepad. The late afternoon had begun to shift toward evening, and the golden sunlight reflected off the tall courthouse windows behind them. Cars passed by slowly, and the distant hum of the city continued like nothing unusual was happening. But the situation on the sidewalk had quietly become something far more important than Carter realized. Marcus remained standing where he had been placed, his hands still secured behind his back. Despite the uncomfortable position, he kept his posture straight and his expression calm. He didn't argue, and he didn't complain. Instead, he simply waited. Carter began writing notes in his pad. "Name, Marcus Reed," he muttered quietly to himself. recording the information he had already seen on the identification card. From Carter's perspective, this was routine procedure. Officers documented situations like this every day: brief stops, detentions, suspicious activity reports. He believed he was simply following protocol. What he didn't think about was the technology surrounding him. Attached to the front of Carter's uniform was his body camera, a small black device silently recording everything happening in front of him. Every word he spoke, every command he gave, and every response Marcus provided was being captured in high-definition audio and video. Just a few feet above the courthouse entrance, another security camera was also recording the scene. Its wide lens captured both men from a higher angle, showing the entire interaction on the sidewalk. Across the street, mounted on a traffic pole, a city traffic camera quietly monitored the intersection as part of the municipal safety system. Though its primary purpose was traffic control, its camera still captured portions of the sidewalk where Carter and Marcus stood. 3 different recording systems, 3 separate angles, and every one of them had been running since the moment Carter stepped out of his patrol car. Marcus glanced briefly toward the courthouse entrance. He noticed the small dome-shaped security camera mounted above the doorway, its lens reflecting sunlight. He didn't say anything about it. Instead, he returned his gaze to the quiet street ahead. Carter finished writing and looked up again. "So," the officer said, slipping the notepad back into his pocket. "How long were you standing here before I arrived?" Marcus thought for a moment. "About 10 minutes. Doing nothing but waiting?" "Yes." Carter shook his head slightly, still unconvinced. "Most people don't just stand around government buildings for 10 minutes. Marcus responded calmly. "Most people also don't get handcuffed for waiting outside one." For a brief moment, Carter didn't respond. The comment wasn't aggressive, but it clearly challenged the officer's reasoning. "You keep acting like this is unusual," Carter said. "It's a basic investigation." Marcus didn't argue further. Instead, he simply nodded and fell silent again. The quiet tension between them continued as the minutes passed. Inside the courthouse building behind them, employees moved through hallways and offices, unaware that the small camera outside had captured a developing situation. Later that evening, those recordings would be reviewed during routine system checks. And when supervisors eventually compared the footage to the officer's written report, they would notice something troubling. The story described on paper wouldn't match what the cameras had clearly captured. At that moment on the sidewalk, however, Carter remained confident he was simply doing his job. He had no idea that every second of his decision-making had already been preserved. And soon, those recordings would begin raising serious questions. The evening air had grown slightly cooler as the sun slowly lowered behind the tall buildings of downtown Arlington. The golden light that had once filled the street was fading into softer shadows, and the normal rhythm of the city continued around Officer Daniel Carter and Marcus Reed. Marcus still stood near the courthouse steps, his hands cuffed behind his back. Although the metal restraints were uncomfortable, he remained steady and composed. His calm demeanor hadn't changed since the moment Carter placed the handcuffs on him. Officer Carter, however, seemed determined to justify the situation he had created. He stepped a few feet away and spoke briefly into the radio attached to his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Unit 27, Carter said. "Running an ID check. Name is Marcus Reed." A moment later, the radio crackled back to life. "Copy that, Unit 27, stand by." Marcus listened quietly while Carter waited for the response. The officer stood with his arms crossed, occasionally glancing toward Marcus as if expecting him to suddenly become nervous or defensive. But Marcus remained silent. A couple of pedestrians walked past, whispering to each other as they glanced toward the scene. One woman slowed down, clearly curious about why a calm man in professional clothing was standing in handcuffs outside a courthouse. Carter noticed the attention but ignored it. To him, the situation was under control. Marcus finally spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "Officer Carter, how long do you plan to keep me detained?" Carter shrugged slightly. "Until I'm satisfied everything checks out." Marcus nodded slowly. "And what exactly needs to check out?" he asked. Carter looked slightly irritated by the question. "You being here," he said. "Your story, your identity, everything." Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward the courthouse doors once more. People continued entering and leaving the building, most unaware of what was happening just outside. "I already gave you my identification," Marcus said quietly, "and I told you why I'm here." Carter shook his head again. "That's what you said," he replied. "But I verify things before I let people walk away." Just then, the radio crackled again. "Unit 27. Dispatch." Carter grabbed the radio. "Go ahead." "It returns clear. No warrants, no alerts." Carter paused for a moment. In most situations, that would have been the end of the encounter. A clean identification check usually meant there was no legal reason to continue holding someone. But Carter wasn't ready to let the situation end. "Copy," he replied briefly. Marcus noticed the hesitation. "So everything is clear?" Marcus asked. Carter avoided answering directly. "I'm still figuring things out," he said. Marcus took a slow breath, maintaining his calm. Across the street, the man who had earlier pulled out his phone was still standing there, occasionally glancing toward the scene. Above the courthouse entrance, the security camera continued its silent recording. Every minute of Marcus's detention was now being documented. Carter walked a short circle around the area, thinking through the situation in his mind. He had already detained Marcus publicly, and releasing him immediately now felt like admitting the stop might not have been necessary. His pride quietly pushed him to continue. Finally, Carter stopped and turned back toward Marcus. "Here's what we're going to do," he said. "I'm going to write a brief report about this stop. Once I'm done, we'll see what happens next." Marcus nodded slightly, though his eyes reflected quiet disbelief. "All right," he said simply. For Carter, it still felt like routine procedure. But the longer Marcus remained detained without clear justification, the more serious the situation was becoming. And somewhere inside the courthouse, systems were quietly storing every second of video from the cameras outside. Soon, someone would review that footage. And when they did, the officer's decisions would no longer be just his version of events. They would be seen exactly as they happened. By early evening, the streets of downtown Arlington were gradually quieter. The sun had dipped below the skyline, leaving a soft golden glow that reflected off the courthouse windows. Officer Daniel Carter still stood near Marcus Reed, his posture tense as he scribbled notes into his pocket-sized notepad. Marcus, in contrast, remained calm, his hands cuffed behind him but his expression composed and measured. Meanwhile, the cameras that had silently captured the entire interaction were already storing the footage on official servers. Carter's body camera, the courthouse's security system, and the city traffic camera each recorded the encounter from different perspectives. At the time, neither man realized that these recordings would soon raise serious questions about what had actually transpired. Back at the police station, Officer Carter filed his preliminary report. His words painted the interaction as a routine detention of a potentially suspicious individual. He wrote that Marcus had appeared evasive, uncooperative, and slightly defiant. Carter believed he was simply documenting the truth. What he didn't know was how sharply his version would contrast with the visual evidence. Later that night, routine administrative checks began. A supervisor, Lieutenant Amanda Phillips, started reviewing body camera footage from several patrol officers, including Carter's. When she arrived at the clip showing the encounter with Marcus Reed, she paused immediately. The officer's report and the footage did not match. In the video, Marcus remained calm and compliant throughout the stop. He answered questions clearly, produced his identification promptly, and showed no signs of aggression or resistance. Carter's voice was raised, his commands firm, and his tone increasingly impatient. Every step of escalation, the threats of detention, the handcuffing, and the repeated questioning was clearly documented. Lieutenant Phillips leaned closer to the screen, noting the subtle but important details. Marcus never resisted. His body language was composed, and his responses were measured. Carter, however, seemed visibly frustrated and increasingly authoritarian as the encounter continued. The contrast was striking. By the time she finished watching the first 2 minutes, Phillips knew that the incident warranted a deeper review. She immediately flagged the footage for internal affairs. Another officer, trained to analyze behavior and policy compliance, would later examine both the video and Carter's written report. Already, discrepancies were evident. Carter, oblivious to the scrutiny, left the station later that evening, confident that his actions were routine and justified. Meanwhile, the files containing every angle of the interaction had been securely stored, ready for review. Each frame, each word, and each movement was preserved. The realization that Marcus Reed had remained calm and professional under unnecessary detention would soon challenge the officer's account. What Carter believed was simple procedural work was now the center of an unfolding investigation. And as the official inquiry began to take shape, Marcus's quiet composure and the objective evidence captured by the cameras would gradually reveal a larger truth. Authority misused, even unintentionally, could never escape accountability. The video, silent but powerful, was about to tell the story in a way words never could, setting the stage for consequences that would reach far beyond that small sidewalk outside the courthouse. The following morning, Arlington Police Department was already buzzing with routine activity, but a quiet sense of scrutiny had begun to settle over the administrative offices. Lieutenant Amanda Phillips had flagged the body camera footage of Officer Daniel Carter's encounter with Marcus Reed for further review. What initially appeared to be a routine detention now demanded the attention of internal affairs. Inside a small, fluorescent-lit conference room, the internal affairs team gathered. Files, computers, and recordings were spread across the table. Detective Liam Cross, an experienced investigator with a reputation for thoroughness, was assigned to examine the situation. His first step was to review every angle of the incident: the body camera, the courthouse security footage, and the city traffic camera. As Cross began the review, the sequence of events was unmistakable. Marcus Reed had remained composed, hands visible and movements measured. He had answered questions politely, followed instructions, and did not display any behavior that could justify detention. Carter, in contrast, had escalated the situation unnecessarily, issuing commands with increasing impatience and frustration. Cross paused the video at several key moments, noting Carter's aggressive tone, the handcuffing, and the repeated questioning. These details were logged meticulously, alongside timestamps and frames from the video. Each angle told the same story. The civilian had done nothing wrong, and the officer had overstepped his authority. Meanwhile, internal memos circulated quietly, outlining the importance of adhering to procedural justice and the implications of public accountability. It became clear that this situation, though brief, could have serious ramifications for Officer Carter. A key focus of the inquiry was Carter's report. Cross compared the written account with the video evidence. Discrepancies were immediately apparent. The report suggested that Marcus had been evasive and uncooperative, whereas the footage clearly showed calm compliance. Every time Carter claimed resistance, the video disproved him. This gap between perception and reality formed the core of the investigation. Cross also considered the public impact. Though the incident was not yet widely known, footage of police misconduct could easily reach the public if released. Even the possibility of reputational damage for the department added urgency to the inquiry. Internal affairs needed to establish the facts clearly, without speculation or bias, ensuring transparency in their findings. By mid-morning, Cross compiled a preliminary report highlighting the key inconsistencies, noting Marcus Reed's composure and documenting Carter's escalation. The next step involved interviewing witnesses. Pedestrians who had observed the scene and courthouse staff with potential oversight on surveillance cameras would provide further perspectives. As the inquiry unfolded, it became evident that this was more than a simple stop. The recordings painted a clear narrative. A routine patrol had escalated into an unjust detention, captured in meticulous detail. Accountability now rested on the evidence, not perception, and Carter's actions would be examined under the strictest professional standards. By the end of the day, the investigation had officially begun, setting in motion a process that would test not only Officer Carter's judgment, but also the effectiveness of evidence in holding authority figures accountable. Marcus Reed, unaware of the review underway, had already proven that calm and dignity in the face of aggression could speak louder than any argument. The internal inquiry into Officer Daniel Carter's actions had gained momentum. By mid-morning, Detective Liam Cross had reviewed the footage multiple times, each viewing revealing more details that contradicted Carter's report. Every gesture, every word, every command was captured on multiple cameras. Marcus Reed's calm, composed demeanor stood in stark contrast to the officer's escalating frustration and assertive behavior. Cross prepared a detailed timeline of the events. At 5:42 p.m., Carter approached Marcus outside the courthouse. By 5:45, Marcus had produced his identification calmly and without hesitation. By 5:48, Carter had placed him in handcuffs, citing vague, suspicious behavior. Cross noted that at no point did Marcus resist, act aggressively, or display behavior that would warrant such a response. As Cross compiled his notes, he began comparing Carter's written report to the video evidence. The discrepancies were undeniable. Carter's account described Marcus as evasive and uncooperative, while the footage clearly showed compliance. Each time Carter issued a command or raised his voice, Marcus answered politely and with restraint. The contrast between perception and reality was stark. Cross decided to focus on the moments where Carter's authority had visibly escalated the situation. He noted the officer's raised voice, the unnecessary repetition of commands, and the tense body language that made an already uncomfortable encounter more intimidating. Every frame of video reinforced the conclusion that Marcus had done nothing to justify detention beyond being in the wrong place at the wrong time. At this stage, the inquiry team began drafting an internal memorandum to highlight the significance of the evidence. They emphasized that objective recordings had become crucial in evaluating the officer's conduct. Carter's report alone was no longer sufficient. The video told the true story. The internal affairs team also reached out to witnesses who had observed the incident from nearby sidewalks. A security officer from a nearby business confirmed seeing Marcus remain calm and unthreatening. Pedestrians who had slowed to watch the encounter provided corroborating accounts. Each statement reinforced the evidence captured on the cameras. By late afternoon, Lieutenant Amanda Phillips convened a meeting with senior department officials. The footage, combined with the witness statements, left no room for ambiguity. Carter's conduct was clearly inconsistent with departmental policies regarding detention and engagement with civilians. The evidence was damning. Even Carter's colleagues began to see the situation differently when shown the footage. The narrative of a suspicious civilian had shifted entirely to a story of misuse of authority and procedural overreach. Marcus Reed's calm composure under pressure now became the focal point of the investigation. The impact of the recorded evidence was profound. What Carter had assumed was a routine, justified interaction was now under serious scrutiny. Every action he had taken was visible, analyzable, and accountable. By the end of the day, the internal affairs team understood that this incident would serve as a case study in the power of objective documentation. Evidence, they realized, had the power to expose misconduct, challenge false narratives, and ultimately ensure accountability. Marcus Reed, though unaware of the inquiry unfolding behind the scenes, had already become the silent witness whose behavior and the recordings would shape the outcome decisively. By the next morning, the full weight of the situation had begun to settle over Officer Daniel Carter. The internal inquiry had progressed rapidly, and the evidence compiled by Detective Liam Cross and the internal affairs team left little room for interpretation. Every angle of the interaction between Carter and Marcus Reed had been reviewed, and the conclusion was clear. The officer had overstepped his authority. Carter arrived at the police department, expecting a routine briefing. Instead, he was escorted to a quiet conference room where Lieutenant Amanda Phillips and Detective Cross were waiting. Their expressions were professional but serious. Carter could sense immediately that this was not going to be a casual discussion. "Officer Carter," Lieutenant Phillips began, "we've reviewed the incident involving Marcus Reed. We have the body camera footage, courthouse security footage, and traffic camera recordings. I want you to walk us through your decisions during the encounter." Carter shifted slightly in his chair, clearing his throat. "I followed standard procedure," he said defensively. "I noticed suspicious behavior, and I detained the individual to ensure compliance and safety." Detective Cross leaned forward. "The footage tells a different story. Marcus Reed remained calm, compliant, and cooperative throughout the encounter. Can you explain why your report indicates evasive behavior and non-compliance?" Carter swallowed hard. The evidence was unmistakable. Every gesture, every calm word from Marcus, and every repeated command he issued had been recorded. There was no plausible way to reinterpret the events in his favor. I acted according to my training," Carter stammered. "I was concerned for safety. I thought—" He paused. realizing that excuses would carry little weight against the video evidence. Lieutenant Phillips nodded slowly. "Officer, this is about accountability. We need to understand your decisions, your reasoning, and why you escalated the situation unnecessarily." Carter's confidence began to falter. For the first time, he felt the weight of being observed objectively. The handcuffs, the repeated commands, the threats of detention, all were documented. The calm civilian Marcus Reed had become a mirror reflecting his own actions back at him. Cross presented still frames from the footage, each showing Marcus standing patiently, responding politely, and complying fully with instructions. The contrast between Carter's report and the video was undeniable. Carter realized that no matter how he justified his actions verbally, the objective evidence spoke louder than his words. "I understand," Carter said quietly. I may have overreacted." Phillips leaned back. "Acknowledging that is the first step. The next is understanding the impact of your actions. Misuse of authority doesn't just affect the individual involved, it affects public trust in the department as a whole." Carter nodded, feeling the gravity of the moment. For the first time, he recognized that policing was not only about authority but also about responsibility, accountability, and respect for procedure. The Internal Affairs team began drafting recommendations for corrective measures, including mandatory retraining and counseling. The evidence would also be used to reinforce proper protocol to other officers. Carter's actions would serve as a lesson. Even a brief encounter could escalate unnecessarily if authority was exercised without full awareness and restraint. Marcus Reed, though unaware of the internal review, had already made his mark. His calm, composed, and respectful behavior under pressure had not only revealed misconduct, but had also ensured that the officer's actions would be held accountable. By the end of the day, Carter left the meeting with a heavy understanding. Authority without accountability was meaningless, and the consequences of unchecked behavior could never be ignored. The incident had transformed from a routine stop into a powerful lesson in responsibility. The days following the internal inquiry were tense for Officer Daniel Carter. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the review had moved from preliminary investigation to formal evaluation. Lieutenant Amanda Phillips and Detective Liam Cross had compiled a comprehensive report detailing Carter's unnecessary escalation during the detention of Marcus Reed. Every frame of video, every recorded word, and every witness account reinforced the same conclusion: the officer had overstepped his authority. Carter sat quietly in the briefing room, facing the senior review board. He understood that this was not just a procedural matter, it was a moment that would define his career and reputation. The board members, including Phillips and Cross, presented the findings methodically. The discrepancy between Carter's report and the video footage was highlighted, along with evidence of Marcus Reed's calm, cooperative behavior throughout the encounter. "Officer Carter," Lieutenant Phillips began, "this review has shown that your actions during the detention of Mr. Reed were not consistent with department policy. The use of handcuffs, repeated commands, and the escalation of the situation were unnecessary." Carter swallowed hard, knowing there was no way to dispute the facts. "I understand," he said quietly. "I misjudged the situation. I acted too quickly, and I failed to recognize that Mr. Reed was cooperating the entire time." The board nodded, acknowledging that is important. This incident serves as a reminder that authority must be exercised responsibly, and that respect for civilians and proper procedure is critical to public trust. As the discussion continued, the focus shifted toward corrective measures. Carter would be required to undergo retraining on community engagement, procedural compliance, and conflict de-escalation. He would also participate in counseling sessions to address the underlying attitudes that contributed to the escalation. Meanwhile, the department emphasized that Marcus Reed's behavior had set a standard for civilians interacting with law enforcement. His calm, composed, and respectful demeanor under pressure had revealed the truth and allowed objective evidence to highlight misconduct. It was a powerful reminder that accountability was not only enforced internally, but also reflected through the actions of those affected. Carter reflected on the entire experience. He remembered standing on the courthouse sidewalk, watching Marcus remain composed, answering questions politely, and not reacting to the unnecessary detention. Those moments, now preserved on multiple cameras, had shifted the balance of power. He realized that authority without accountability was meaningless, and that a single encounter could have profound consequences. By the end of the day, the case was formally closed, but its lessons lingered. Marcus Reed had gone about his life unaware of the impact of his calm composure, while Officer Carter carried the memory of the encounter as a pivotal turning point in his career. The incident also served as a departmental lesson. Technology, transparency, and adherence to procedure were essential in ensuring justice. Officers learned that actions would be scrutinized not just through written reports, but through recorded evidence, eyewitness accounts, and public perception. Carter left the meeting with a new perspective on his role. He understood that respect, patience, and professionalism were not optional, they were fundamental. The encounter with Marcus Reed had begun as a simple detention, but it evolved into a powerful lesson in responsibility, accountability, and the importance of integrity in law enforcement. From that day forward, Carter knew that every interaction, no matter how routine, could be recorded, reviewed, and remembered, and that the right choice, even under pressure, could make all the difference.